Cars started to become a much more common thing to see on the streets of Central European cities, and very quickly it became clear that the hundreds of years old infrastructure will not keep up. City planners and officials needed to act, and similarly as in other regions of the world, they would decide on massive changes to the city's landscapes by building brand new urban highways and adding lanes to big avenues. Welcome back to Altengrad City, everyone, where in the background we will also start building an urban highway in the center of the city that is going to mercilessly carve into the older city blocks, cut off streets and pedestrian access, but it will create that shiny new modern infrastructure emphasizing the progress and allowing easier passage through the city for everyone's favorite mode of transport. Let's first talk about the real world to look at some context. In episode 66, I covered the topic of cars, car ownership in the Eastern Bloc, and most importantly, the evolution of numbers of cars. The key information were the initial reluctance of communist leaderships to shift resources towards personal car manufacturing, but even then, the general shortage of new cars and only tiny amount of imports. This meant that personal car numbers boomed in the 60s, but more in the 70s, unlike, for example, in the United States. In the Central European region of the Eastern Bloc, things would change a lot slower and also a lot later, thankfully, as of course the problems with the legacy of decades of oversized car infrastructure is widely known today. Nevertheless, the changes that did happen over here happened with the unfortunate, usual brutal disregard for the existing city. But anyways, before we dive into too much theory, let's take a look at various cities around the region to see for ourselves what was built, how, and when. Two major cities that would see extensive reworks of the inner city infrastructure were, unsurprisingly, cities that were also extensively damaged during the Second World War: Berlin and Warsaw. In Warsaw, rebuilding started fairly quickly after the war. Whole districts would not be restored to their original layouts, but instead more recent, modernist, then socialist realism, then modernist again ideas would take over, so establishing new huge avenues in socialist realism for that monumental feel, in modernism to prepare for the inevitable increase in traffic and its functional division, separation from the other places. So the grid-like pattern of main avenues is the result of the gradual rebuilding of the destroyed city, somewhat using the destruction as an opportunity to prepare a better functioning city for the needs of a future human. A notable project is the tunnel below the very old part of the city. The restoration of Warsaw's old town is on its own very interesting. I highly recommend you to check out some backstory for that. But even in these super old places, it was decided right away that some modern changes will happen, like a much more convenient east-west cut through the old town. This not-so-long tunnel was built in 1948-49, and what's really interesting about it is the scenery from old photos, which does not show just the tunnel construction site, but the rest of the city around it is also a construction site still, with buildings being restored or built anew. So this was one of those projects that very early indicated how cities would be shaped in the future. Fast forward some 20 years, when cars were already everywhere and in great numbers, Warsaw needed to continue adding lanes, but also new roads entirely. The Lazenkowska Road is a more typical late 60s, early 70s urban highway, which utilizes the grade separation already and overall cuts the places it goes through in half with very little way for pedestrians to cross. Interestingly, it also cuts an older socialist realism district, which was back in the day intended to work with some sort of big avenue to create that monumental boulevard, but with a highway, it just fails to provide that completely. Not to mention the existing buildings having windows directly into a highway is amazing on its own. Further towards the river, later, the highway reaches an interchange which beautifully complements these mid-1960s modernist residential towers, which actually look pretty good on their own. They are one of the rarer examples of custom residential architecture, but only a few years after the completion, the residents already received the privilege of watching and breathing heavy traffic every day right below their windows. It's actually hard to say if the architects of the towers knew of the infrastructure plans. I saw some pictures of models of the towers without the highways, but as we will later see, it is entirely possible that the designers of the time unironically thought this will actually be a good living environment, and visually the interchange will truly work with some of these buildings to create a beautiful scenery. The famous Alexanderplatz in Berlin and the surrounding open spaces is probably the largest such semi-open area in the whole region, but it is again the result of the post-war rebuilding. East Berlin was in general rebuilt slower compared to Warsaw, for example, since it was just the Soviet occupation zone until the official formation of East Germany in 1949, which just so happened to also be the year of adopting socialist realism. But unlike Warsaw, we don't find that extensive use of it, apart from some notable examples on the Karl Marx Allee, but I digress. We will talk about architecture plenty more in the series. Let's return to the infrastructure. The whole area around Alexanderplatz is crisscrossed with huge roads that date back to the 1960s, when the place was supposed to be rebuilt into a model socialist square for huge crowds of people. These stitched pictures from 1970, taken from the Berlin TV tower, speak for themselves when it comes to illustrating the importance of cars in the minds of the planners of the era. It somehow becomes worse the more you look. Notice, for example, the huge parking lots inside of the medians that are already huge. There are also plenty of fast right-hand turn curves on the side of the intersections, thoroughly making it much worse for pedestrians to cross. Those turns are actually gone today. I don't even see any painted crosswalks, certainly not near the intersections. And as if the lanes were not enough, there is also the brand new Alexanderplatz tunnel that we can actually see both ends of in here. Those are of course not the only new roads. There are plenty of such either new or widened avenues from this time period all around East Berlin, especially in places where old city blocks were completely torn down to make way for first socialist realism and then some prefabricated modernism. But then we have cities where war damage was not that extensive, at least not to the extent that it could be used as an excuse to just remodel whole city districts for future generations. Such is the case of Prague or Bratislava. For Prague, I was able to find an article from 1957 that was dealing with future traffic problems and potential solutions. What was really fascinating is that the article was written using basically today's language, as if it was written by someone directly witnessing the huge volumes of today's cars, so mentioning the various problems such as noise, bad air, or simply space taken by vehicles on the streets. Remember, 1957, there were not that many cars around just yet. The occasional babbling about how better infrastructure will lead to better communist tomorrow quickly reminded me of the time it was written, though. Nevertheless, the article also presented a sort of priority summary, and this is absolutely crucial to understand the era. It listed the modes like this in this exact order: railways, both cargo and passengers, then road vehicles, also both cargo and personal, and then public transport, other than trains, so trams and buses. The article very thoroughly dealt with railways, which only highlights their incredible importance at the time. The road traffic is then focused on the uncertainty of the evolution, but it also clearly mentioned that the road infrastructure must be expanded for cargo, not just personal cars, because railways could not keep up alone for transporting the huge amounts of cargo. There is a correct identification of the higher efficiency of public transport, and there was also a tiny discussion whether or not it makes economic sense to build infrastructure for the inefficient personal car. But the article, nevertheless, simply accepts the fact that there will be more cars in the future, and there's no point debating that, as, quote, we would be contradicting the need for increasing the standards of living, end quote. Which nicely illustrates that at this time point, owning a car was already seen as a way to achieve higher standards of living, which was the official stance of the communist leaderships as well, and that was simply that. On a little side note, there are a couple of old 1960s news clips where the presenters say phrases like, when everyone has a car, or in the future everyone will drive a car, or more bluntly, something along the lines of, when our progressive society allows everyone to have a car. Of course, the reality of car manufacturing was something else, but it is still interesting to see the mindset of the time. Anyways, let's go back to Prague. So, right from the 1950s, possibly even earlier, there were plans to provide large roads and urban highways. Unlike some other cities, Prague's planners immediately recognized the need to not cut down the very old parts of the city, and on the contrary, to divert traffic away from it. The slightly younger city districts from late 19th century forward were fine to touch, though. Similarly to Warsaw, and I guess Berlin, planners wanted to crisscross the city with a grid of east, west, north, south avenues at first, but these plans eventually changed into the, even today, accepted plans of instead creating several rings around the city, although originally much closer to the center, with various roads radiating between the rings and outside of the city completely. Big chunk of these plans were never built, some were completely scrapped, some are somewhat still considered and awaiting construction with some changes, which is exactly the same development as in Warsaw, for example. We are going to see some Prague's infrastructure projects in other videos, especially the underground ones later, but let's today at least mention the infamous North-South Avenue, which is the only remnant of the original plan for the grid of avenues. It is one of the huge inspirations for what I'm building in Altengrad in the time-lapse, so let's mention this real-life project a little more. It was built in phases throughout the 1970s. It destroyed several old buildings and building blocks, but actually not that many, and further in the south it splits into two ways and goes through older blocks on separate streets, which it unfortunately thoroughly ruins for purposes other than car traffic. It then continues on a very modern-looking minimalist stacked bridge, also built for metro, which runs directly below the deck of the road. The avenue then continues as a proper urban highway, destroying various squares, streets, and just otherwise makes places thoroughly miserable. Let's return to the Prague's main train station, because as part of the Avenues project, the new station building with the metro station underground were built. You can't really see them since the new station is under the avenue and the big parking lot on the top, as you can see over here. The historical building was basically made completely redundant. The top surface level in front of it was completely taken by the avenue, which you can't even cross on the surface, so it's completely car-only place. This area is actually somewhat interesting to study a little more because it showcases one crucial aspect of these infrastructure projects. Let me explain the problem a little more, and then I will get to the point, so you will see what I mean. Adam Something made a video about Prague some time ago, and he started it with basically exiting the historical building right into the avenue, saying something about Soviet megalomania, whatever. But what I immediately thought when watching that was, why on earth would he even go there? Why not just act like a normal person and simply go through the underground modern station and exit into the park? Or just board the metro and go places? But it occurred to me that I accidentally realized, well, that is the whole problem, isn't it? That automatic resignation about that space. The station is built so that a human must crawl underground because the surface is car land. That is the order of things. And if someone exits the historical building, if someone even wants to look at the historical building from the surface, then they must be a lunatic because they go against some natural order. But it's not natural at all, is it? We simply accepted it because the station looks like that for longer than most of us are even alive. The Prague's Avenue does similar things to other places where it goes. There are squares that are just cut with it and completely ruined for their initial purpose. But it is what it is, so people simply don't go to these squares anymore. Shops moved away, people forgot, car demand has been induced, and it became the new order of the public space. Except no one actually likes the place anymore. But it doesn't really matter, since people simply moved elsewhere and sort of left the field. Next to the station is a new 1960s building of the Federal Assembly. Nowadays, it's part of the National Museum. I actually find the building quite interesting, architecturally and certainly technically, but I digress. Maybe there will be some other time to show it. But what's really interesting is the history of how it related to the avenue, because the avenue is a couple of years younger. Interviews with the architect of this building nicely showed the position of a building architect compared to a traffic planner or some road designer/engineer, because those were absolutely the kind of people on top of the food chain. Your new design is in the way of the road? Well, you have to rework your building design. I decided that I will add more lanes, split ways, or otherwise change my mind about the road. Well, you better change your building to comply to my choices. What was that? Your building is about to be built and changing plans is impossible at this stage? Well, I just don't see how that's my problem. Such was the very common way of building car infrastructure that we can frequently see all over Central Europe still. If you absolutely must have those pesky pedestrians use the space, well, just make them crawl underground. But at the same time, let's also put the roads next to important, busy places to emphasize the future progress of the new world. And new architecture, well, that should of course go directly next to the big roads because it's such an inseparable part of the new modern look of our wealthy society where everyone will eventually have a car. But nevertheless, even though traffic projects were significantly prioritized, simply looking at the unfinished parts of them, or better yet, reading about their histories, shows that even they did not escape the consistent lack of funds, especially in the later decades in the socialist countries, despite some of the actual megalomaniac plans that were quite actively presented to the public. So in a way, there is some good in the inability of the regimes to fully go through with the plans. But arguably, it's hard to say if the half-done projects are better or worse. Not just infrastructure, but I digress once more. Bratislava saw one of the most disgusting cuts into its center. While the very old towns in various cities were somewhat off limits, the planners in Bratislava in mid-1960s thought it would be a perfect location for a new major urban highway to connect into the gigantic new city expansion south across Danube. The highway cuts right through the old town, forming a trench, actually with only a few places where people can cross it. On one end of the old town, the highway somewhat ends into a huge intersection with a straight direction in a tunnel. The intersection itself is a beautiful marvel of engineering, as you can see, with amazing markings on it, as if the engineer just downloaded intersection marking tools and wanted to see what it can do. There is also the presidential palace just next to the intersection, creating a perfect place to represent the country. The plaza with the fountain must also be a great place to chill. But don't worry, if the traffic noise is too much, you can just crawl down into a hole, into a shopping underpass, because having busy pedestrian street with shops would spook the cars too much on the surface, and we can't have that in a modern city. On the other side of the old town, the highway interchange also destroyed a big chunk of old blocks on the waterfront. Actually, some of the old news clips from this project are pretty wild. Majority are some reports showing bulldozers making way for the new construction, while the presenters say in a cheery voice how soon citizens will have a modern new bridge across the river and how it will greatly improve the life of workers and how there is absolutely no place for the old backward stuff in our progressive society and whatnot. But you can also find clips where some of the remaining old buildings are taken care of, where the presenter speaks of the utmost need to preserve the works of our ancestors, while the cameraman just keeps panning to the demolition sites closer to the river. Clips from the 1990s then show vast majority of nearby old buildings in shocking conditions, so the need wasn't that hot apparently. The new modern highway bridge crosses Danube and creates one of the few vital connections between the southern and northern city parts, 4 buses among cars. The southern part of the city across the river is Petržalka, the largest panel housing estate in Central Europe, built from scratch starting in 1970s. I could probably talk for hours about this district, probably going on a rant about how planners of the regime simply bit off more than they could chew with this project, but let's keep it focused on the infrastructure. This entire place started to be designed in the mid-1960s and even saw architectural entries from abroad, from Japan, United States, Austria, for example, to compete in a free competition. Most of these entries were absolutely unhinged when it comes to highway infrastructure. In the typical 1960s fashion for a brand new utopian modernist estate, architects let loose their inner megalomaniac and proposed ridiculous highway networks between enormous continuous buildings. Of course, nothing even close to that could have been realistically built, as it must have been made using the standardized prefabricated systems. And even then, the place was barely finished. Nevertheless, some elements of the original designs were used, so there are massive highway interchanges at the entrance, because that is obviously the best use of the waterfront land. And then several other highways continue inside the estate, so much for diverting major traffic away from the panel housing. I could go on and on about various other traffic projects of the second half of the 20th century in Central Europe. There are some true beauties around here where you really have to wonder if the designer thought, yeah, that will be fine. That's what people want to have right below their windows. But let's not turn this episode into an uncontrolled rant about that. There will be plenty of opportunities with other projects some other time, and besides, you probably get the idea. Now, let's go look at the time-lapse. So as you can see, this project is super straightforward on one hand, but on the other hand, it's of course a significant change to the city because we are just cutting down a lot of these old blocks and replacing them with the highway. In this central part of the city, the highway is running parallel to the railways, and at the train station, at the main train station right here, it is looking super similar to that real-life example that I showed you. So that is exactly that inspiration. Now, let's first mention some kind of background for this project. At first, I wanted to go for some sort of a inner city rework with some kind of modern architecture. I don't really want to spoil it too much. It's going to be the topic of the next episode and the next episode as well. So there's going to be plenty of time to deal with that. But at first, I really needed to define this highway already. It's kind of a similar story as, for example, with that Federal Assembly building in Prague. It also needed to accommodate the new avenue, so it needed to slightly change its surroundings, the open spaces around it, and the building itself needed to just respect the new road. So that's exactly what I need to have in here as well. I need to see where the highway is going to go because, I just needed to plan all of this. That was not easy at all. I'm obviously not showing that in the time lapse, but that took a long time. And after I know that, after I know how wide the avenue needs to be and just exactly what kind of space it's going to take, then after that I can start thinking about some new buildings around it, yeah? So I really do need to have the highway first thing done in this area. Right, so that's that. We are just going to focus on some architecture around it in the next episodes. Now, let's talk about some technicalities of this project. So, as you can see, I'm building some kind of interchanges, I'm doing lots of custom intersections, and for exactly these kinds of purposes, I wanted to have custom roads. So I prepared my own custom networks in the road builder. They are nothing fancy, really. I'm not really sure if they are actually highways or just normal roads. I think I prepared like different versions for different kinds of lane configurations, of course, but even some different configurations of shoulders and just like very niche applications that, or for some very niche applications that I'm thinking I'm gonna use it for, yeah? So all these different ramps as well, all the surface roads near this intersection, for example, this interchange, are also custom because I was already thinking I really want to do it like super customized, super compact as well in this particular area. So I really needed to have a custom network for that. Now, it definitely paid off. It didn't really take that long time to prepare these networks, but it definitely paid off. And of course, they are completely blank, these kinds of roads. So I can just build whatever kind of structure I need. So I, for example, equipped this highway with like a custom curb, with some kind of railings, and obviously all of these markings and everything else. Using intersection marking tools, of course. I also had to do something with this tram. It's not really going to be significantly changed, but the road it was going on is now shifted towards that interchange area of this main avenue, of this highway, and the tram would just be very in the way of all the infrastructure there. Not to mention it would just need to like go around this entire area too much. So I decided to split it from the road, and it's actually going to serve as also a pedestrian access below the highway, below the railway. At first I wanted to create crosswalks through the interchange, but it was just not cooperating. The custom roads were just not cooperating with that at all. The interchange is super compact, so, you know, City Skylines doesn't really like that too much with these kinds of custom projects. So I'm actually kind of glad that I managed to do the interchange the way it is, just for the cars. Adding pedestrians or some trams to the mix just did not work at all. So this is kind of like a compromise solution to split it. But it's actually going to look rather nice, this separate tunnel for trams and pedestrians. There are going to be the railings on the side of the tram road as well. So it's actually going to look very period specific, yeah? Let's say it this way. Now, on this side of the main train station, there were also some kind of buildings that were somewhat in the way, and they didn't really make any sense after the highway was put in place. So I just cut it all down and replaced it with a parking lot. It kind of feels like a, you know, appropriate thing to do since we are already doing a super disgusting project. Might as well also sprinkle in some parking lots here and there. And it actually makes sense because it's going to be pretty much the only parking lot next to the train station. And with that real life example from Prague, there is also a parking lot in front of the historical building. So here we are just going to make it on the side. So it's kind of similar. Now, there used to be a building block right here, but it had to make way for this new like entrance into that new interchange and basically that main road that continues into different parts of the city. And well, there was just this empty spot, and it feels absolutely perfect to just build some kind of residential, modern residential structures right next to it. There are a couple of places like that in Central Europe where you can notice these kinds of infrastructure projects being accompanied by this new architecture, just to really fill the places where there couldn't really be anything else. I suppose that there could be some kind of a park instead, but you know, we are still in the center of the city, so should not waste space too much. This is what I was talking about. I'm just going to widen this tram road, the tram network, and put just more pedestrians on the side of it. Now, this entire area, obviously, we are still in the city center. I am showing some old places, so I still do have the cobblestone, but I am going to put custom decals on the new surfaces so that it's actually going to look with, it's going to have that modern look with some kind of modern stone tiles, but all the rest of the sidewalks, the old ones, will still have the cobblestone. I think I'm going to do exactly the same thing with that modern architecture in the next couple of episodes. I'm also going to keep all these surfaces, except the asphalt. As you can see, I am already using the new asphalt. There is no other way. Yeah, I cannot have different asphalt textures in the city, but I absolutely need to have asphalt for the highway. That would just look super stupid with cobblestone. And just, using like custom some sort of asphalt decals on the entire length of the highway, I would probably go crazy building that, even with intersection marking tools. And chances are it would just look super terrible in some kind of curves or especially ramps. So yeah, we are suddenly seeing asphalt everywhere, even on the old roads in the city, but it is what it is. It has to be like that, okay? There is no other way with how the game works. So this is exactly what I was talking about. Yeah, those are going to be the tiles that I'm putting in here. As you can see, I'm kind of struggling with some different elevations right there, but eventually it turned out looking good. These days, I'm mostly using these tiles because they are actually part of like a pedestrian path, which I'm just using in its original form right here. And then I have a decal, a matching decal that looks exactly the same. And I'm just using that to fill in all the corners and different kinds of details. Yeah, so that's actually super convenient. Now, in here, I'm still using the old technique of using procedural objects and doing these kinds of railings around. Yeah, sure. I am already doing it with intersection marking tools, with some different, more recent projects, especially around the curves. It's obviously too much work with procedural objects because you have to align every single piece of that railing. But for example, with that tram stop there on the right at the top, I was already using intersection marking tools. So I am very well aware of the possibilities. Now, doing these kind of like decorative the signals at that interchange, they're not really going to work, but they are just there as a decoration, and obviously connecting it with the pedestrian path. I'm not really going to connect all of these places with pedestrian paths. I'm certainly not going to connect the train station, for example, with pedestrian paths, because we really need to finish the architecture, the modern architecture around it. And by the way, those new modern buildings that will be built around the train station and closer to the city center, they will truly change the face of the city quite significantly. Again, just like with some previous projects, I'm not necessarily saying, even together with this highway, that these are nice changes, that this is something I would really like to do where I would like to live. Not really. I'm just trying to do it how it might have been done, all right, if Altengrad was a real-life city. So this is exactly that preparation for it. As you can see, I'm really mercilessly cutting down these old buildings, and here I'm just going to super quickly whip up some kind of construction site using all the cranes and some kind of construction site details that I already prepared for, that prefabricated construction site that I did some time ago, which is still standing, by the way, but soon I will, of course, finish it. But I can just use it as exactly this, some kind of template for these kinds of construction sites. So this is already indicating that there is going to be some kind of new train station building down below the highway, as you can see. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. I'm just going to put these paths around here. Don't really look too much into the construction site. I'm just super quickly putting it in here because at this point I had not exactly like super clear idea how I'm going to do the modern buildings. I already did them right at this point, so I know, but at this point I didn't, all right? So I was just preparing this construction site to make it look like something is going on. Now, then I just detailed this area with lots of decals. I finally realized in this episode that I can actually scale up and down even these mud path decals, which are working wonders with these kinds of like newly built infrastructure projects that really would be quite a lot of muddy in these kinds of edges around it, yeah? Now, we are also going to prepare a couple of like bus stops or some smaller parking lots in front of the train station building. Later in the next episode, going to do it on the other side as well. And also notice that just like in Prague, just like in real life, I'm not really providing any kind of crosswalks across the avenue. Yeah, so it's just going to completely disgustingly cut this place in half. And, pedestrians are just going to be out of luck. This is the transition with this train station area, the immediate surroundings of it. And yeah, it's a huge change, as you can see. The city is not going to look the same at all after this project. This is a slightly different angle where you can see those two new residential towers popping up instead of those old blocks where we had to build that entrance to the interchange. And you can also notice that the traffic is already getting quite heavy on these roads, even though these roads are actually on the edges not really going anywhere. But gameplay-wise, yeah, this kind of road was needed already to just make it easier for cars to drive through the city, because there isn't anything like that just yet. So on one hand, these kinds of projects were needed for traffic, but on the other hand, at what price? And we are not even done, because there will be some more demolitions along the way, and there might be some more of these big roads throughout the city. Or at the very least, we are going to be adding some more lanes. There is, for example, that old truss bridge that is not exactly keeping up with the current traffic, so there needs to be some changes to it too. I'm already planning that somewhat, even though it's gonna be mostly just a rework. Yeah, it's not really gonna be like a new road, but who knows, maybe in the future I will think of a place in the city that needs to have some proper highway infrastructure added. There will, of course, be more highways on the outside of the city, going away from the city, and later we are definitely going to start building some sort of ring connections. I already have it somewhat planned. I think I mentioned in the last episode how I already had to plan it for those new city expansions, so I get some good idea about that. Don't really want to spoil it too much, of course. This corner with these two new residential towers next to the interchange and with all the muddy decals, it's actually something I really like in this particular project, in a weird, twisted way, because like I said, I'm not necessarily building these places to be the nicest. This one is actually quite horrible, but at the same time, I'm trying to achieve some sort of, I don't know, plausible look. Even though Altengrad is completely fictional, of course, I am taking heavy inspiration from real life, but I am not one-to-one copying real-life places. But still, I suppose that I am somewhat satisfied with the outcome of this project, because I kind of feel similar feelings as if I'm looking at some of the real-life projects. So that's, I suppose, a good result, yeah? But anyway, that's gonna be it for today's episode. Thank you for watching it. Hope you liked it, even though you maybe did not like the change. But still, please put the thumbs up below the video, put the comments there, and subscribe to the channel if you're new here, share the video, and big thanks to all the channel members who decided to directly support this channel and me in what I'm doing. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it. Take care. Goodbye.